My name is Clara Vance. I'm 36 years old. Last Monday, three movers carrying a heavy truck froze right halfway up my front walkway. The reason? An elderly man sitting calmly on my porch swing. Behind those movers stood my brother, Julian, casually twirling a freshly cut house key around his finger. Beside him was my mother, Margaret, holding a homemade eviction notice for a home that had never belonged to either of them. The 71-year-old man on the swing wore a gray felt hat, carefully folding his newspaper down the crease like a flag. Resting in his lap was a thick legal folder. What my family didn't know was that folder was only my second layer of defense. The first layer I had signed back in April, when they still assumed I was the family's quiet pushover. And the third document, the one I signed at my kitchen table 2 days after that moving van left empty, is the piece of paper my mother still refuses to speak aloud. It's the paper that cost her a daughter, cost me a mother, and left us both bound to the consequences. To make sense of how we got here, you have to look at the house on Birchwood Lane. It's a 1938 Craftsman built on quiet memories, featuring a porch swing crafted by my grandfather, Arthur, and a garden lovingly tended by my grandmother, Eleanor. For the last 6 years of their lives, I spent every single Saturday afternoon in that house. It started when Grandpa's knees couldn't handle ladders anymore, and Grandma's pill organization became too complicated. I cleaned out the gutters every autumn and swapped out the storm windows every spring. I drove them to doctor's appointments, patiently waiting in lobby chairs with a paperback book. As a city librarian of 11 years, I fit naturally into their world, everything organized, labeled, and put in its place. Grandpa even built a wooden key cabinet with 9 brass hooks, complete with typewritten tags for every key. Label it once, he'd tell me with a wink, and it never argues with you. Over those 6 years of Saturdays, my mother visited exactly 4 times. I know the number because Grandma kept a guest book on the hall table, partly out of politeness, but mostly as evidence. I never once asked my grandparents about their money or their will. Everyone else in this family who ended up screaming about fairness asked constantly, borrowing, taking, and forgetting to repay. I just brought them homemade soup and washed their windows. Let me catalog my family clearly. My mother, Margaret, is 58, works part-time selling insurance, and speaks exclusively in press releases. She doesn't ask, she dictates. Divorced for 20 years, she uses authority like armor. Then there's my 33-year-old brother, Julian. Julian isn't inherently evil, but he was raised with a dangerous assumption that his fair share of the world was being stored in other people's houses, and collecting it was simply a matter of timing. My mother taught him that lesson, though I didn't realize it until much later. The shift began 4 years ago, when Grandma Eleanor's bank account suddenly turned up $30,000 short. It turned out my mother had advanced herself the cash for a failed business venture. The family brushed it off as a misunderstanding, but that same month, my grandparents quietly asked me to drive them to see their family lawyer, George Sterling. They didn't tell me why, and I didn't ask. I sat in the car with my book for over an hour. When they walked out, Grandpa looked lighter, and Grandma held his arm. Neither of them ever uttered a word about what happened inside. 4 years later, both my mother and I found out what was written in those legal papers. Only one of us was caught completely off guard. Grandpa Arthur passed away 3 years ago in his sleep. Grandma Eleanor followed him this past January, holding my hand in a hospice room smelling of lavender and stale coffee. I was the only one beside her bed, not because my mother was cruel, but because Grandma's dying took longer than my mother's schedule permitted. At the funeral, I organized the flowers, managed the guest book, and logged the casserole dishes. I stood by the door for hours reassuring strangers, while my mother dressed in black and gracefully accepted condolences like a queen. In the parking lot after the funeral, before the soil had even settled over her own mother, Margaret grabbed my elbow and leaned in. "We'll discuss arrangements on Sunday," she whispered. She was talking about the house. I nodded softly because back then, keeping the peace was my second nature. But standing in the January cold, holding a spare funeral program, I realized my mother had already pushed my grandmother into the past tense and turned her home into an agenda item. What she didn't realize was that there was no house question. My grandparents had already answered it 4 years earlier in an attorney's office while I sat outside reading a book. My family had spent years assuming they knew what was in that house, but they never bothered to check the paperwork. By March, the legal transfers went through, quietly and without drama. There was no theatrical reading of the will. 4 years ago, my grandparents had set up a transfer-on-death deed for the Craftsman home and payable-on-death designations for all financial accounts. Every single one bore my name. The Birchwood Lane home was appraised at $650,000, and the retirement accounts held another $550,000. A total of $1.2 million passed directly to me, skipping my mother's generation entirely, as legal and final as a label on a key. George Sterling, the lawyer, walked me through the files in his slow, steady voice. "They were very clear, Clara," he told me. "They were protecting this estate from something specific." When my mother realized what had happened, she went silent for 3 days, a full-blown catastrophe in her world. Then she showed up on my porch with an almond cake and what she termed the fair solution: sell the house and split the $1.2 million $3 ways between her, Julian, and me. She spoke like a woman, generously offering to resolve a mistake I had caused. When I gently told her I had no intention of selling Grandma's house, something hardened behind her eyes as she filed my refusal away for later. Immediately, the family phone lines lit up. Distant aunts I barely spoke to suddenly called with lectures on what Grandma would have wanted. A cousin texted a paragraph about family healing alongside a specific dollar amount. Julian messaged me a real estate listing for a vacant plot 2 streets over, no words attached, sliding it over like a menu he expected me to pay for. Standing alone in my grandmother's kitchen, as my phone buzzed endlessly, I felt like someone watching a storm roll in. So in April, I took a step nobody expected from the quiet one. I returned to George Sterling's office, sat in the exact chair my grandparents once occupied, and asked him to build me an ironclad wall, an irrevocable trust. We transferred both the house and the financial accounts into the Croft Family Trust, managed jointly by George and myself. That meant the property no longer belonged to Clara Vance as an individual. It belonged to a legal entity requiring 2 signatures, one belonging to a lawyer who had been practicing law since before I was born. No one could ever pressure me into making an emotional decision during a weak moment, because my weak moments no longer held legal authority. It cost me $6,800, and it was completely silent. No family announcements, no confrontation, just 2 appointments and a notary. As we finalized the papers, George looked over his glasses and asked, "In case of what, Clara?" "Just in case," I replied. He let the sentence rest, recognizing an unsaid truth. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Just in case my mother is exactly who I fear she is, and my brother is exactly who she raised. That same week, George registered the trust with the County Title Alert Service, an automated tripwire that sends an immediate notification if any legal document or lien is filed against the property. I also rekeyed every lock on the house and moved Grandpa's wooden key cabinet into the main hallway where I'd see it every day. Yet, showing how deeply ingrained my habits were, I continued answering my mother's phone calls. You can build a legal wall around a house, but building one around your own heart takes much longer. Throughout the summer, my mother launched a subtle psychological campaign. She'd call about trivial matters, only to ask around the 8-minute mark for the security door code so she could water the plants while I was at work. I politely informed her I had a scheduled routine. In June, Julian dropped by, his first visit since the funeral, wandering upstairs and casually pausing in the master bedroom. "My daughter Lily would love this room for sleepovers, wouldn't she?" he remarked, using his 6-year-old child like a crowbar wrapped in a blanket. An aunt texted saying such a spacious house felt far too lonely for one person. Each comment arrived wrapped in superficial care, but every single one sought the exact same thing: a foothold, a key, a room, or an entry point. I politely turned down every request, holding my ground line by line. Rejecting my family polite refusal by polite refusal came at a heavy toll. Every single no cost me a full night's sleep. I'd lie awake auditing my tone and drafting apologies for offenses I hadn't even committed. That is what a lifetime of peacekeeping does. It convinces you that other people's comfort is your rent, and it bills you nightly. Then, by late summer, something changed. Julian suddenly stopped calling and messaging altogether. My brother had never in his life gone silent around money. It was the kind of unnatural pause after someone draws a deep breath. People like Julian go quiet for exactly one reason. They've stopped asking because they've found another way. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I rechecked the locks twice anyway and touched the leather trust binder on my shelf. I was checking the right things. I just didn't realize what he'd already set in motion. The warning came on a Thursday in late September from Aunt Rose, my mother's younger sister, and the only person in that generation who calls to ask how I am doing rather than what I've decided. Clara, she whispered nervously over the phone while I stood between the library stacks. I don't want to cause trouble, but Julian told your Uncle Ray at poker that the house situation is almost taken care of. Taken care of how? I asked, a heavy weight sinking behind my sternum. I thanked her calmly, hung up, and accidentally misfiled 2 return books, which for a librarian is the equivalent of screaming. That night, I paced the Craftsman house like a night guard, inspecting the windows, the locks, and Grandpa's key cabinet with its 9 brass hooks gleaming under the hallway light. I was looking for a burglar, but the attack moving against me didn't need a broken window. It needed a fraudulent signature, and a county official who stamps papers first and asks questions never. On the last Tuesday of September, my brother slid a single piece of paper across a clerk's counter at the county courthouse. By Thursday afternoon, my legal tripwire went off. At 2:14 p.m., while explaining book hold policies to a patron, my phone vibrated with an automated email from the county recorder's alert service. A document has been recorded affecting parcel 411,872, Birchwood Lane. I opened the attachment right at the circulation desk. It was a quitclaim deed. Grantor, Clara Vance. Grantee, Julian Vance. Consideration, $1 and love and affection. My brother's forgery literally used the word love. The signature on the grantor line wasn't mine. It had sloppy loops where I don't loop, my own name wearing someone else's handwriting like a stolen coat. Below it sat a fake notary stamp dated on a day I could easily prove I worked a full 9-hour shift at the library. My hands went dead steady. 11 years as a librarian turns you into an emergency responder who whispers. I finished with the patron, logged out of my system, and deliberately overrode the impulse to call my mother. Instead, I called George Sterling and read him the document number. Papers stopped shuffling on his end. A heavy pause followed, a pause packed with 45 years of legal experience. Well, George said softly, with a touch of professional awe, he forged the wrong name, Clara. Julian, a man who had never in his life read the fine print on a lease or a loan, had committed 2 major felonies to steal a house from a woman who no longer legally owned it. Here was the anatomy of my brother's critical mistake. Since April, the house on Birchwood Lane hadn't belonged to Clara Vance. It belonged to the Croft Family Trust. Julian had forged a deed from an individual who held no legal title to the property. It was like forging the previous tenant's signature to steal an apartment building. His document wasn't just fraudulent, it was legally void, a paper ghost. But as George pointed out, it was also grand forgery and recording a false public instrument, multiple felony charges. We go strictly by the book, George stated calmly. He immediately prepared a trustee letter flagging the fraudulent filing to the recorder, alongside a certified title report to hand over directly to the sheriff's economic crimes unit. Looking back, the part that embarrasses me most is who I still tried to be that Thursday. I asked George Sterling to wait 48 hours before filing felony charges with the sheriff's department. It was the classic peacekeeper's delusion. hoping that maybe Julian didn't understand what he was filing, or that my mother was truly kept in the dark. I wanted to give them 2 days to prove they were better than the cold evidence. George agreed with the gentle patience lawyers reserve for clients they are fond of. "It's your name they stole, Clara," he told me quietly. For 48 hours, there was total silence. Then, on Saturday morning, my doorbell rang. They arrived as a calculated unit. Julian stood in front, with my mother half a step behind his right shoulder, the exact position she had held for every disaster he had ever created. Close enough to direct his actions, yet far enough to claim she was only there for emotional support. Julian was smirking before the front door was fully open. He held up a ring of freshly cut brass keys and twirled them around his index finger. "We put the house in my name," he announced with practiced arrogance. "You have until Friday to clear out." Behind him, my mother chimed in using her righteous tone. "It's only fair, Clara. It should have been your mother's house all along. We're just correcting what got confused at the end." Correcting what got confused. By confused, she meant 6 years of me sacrificing my weekends to care for my dying grandparents while they were nowhere to be found. Looking at the two of them on that porch, Julian with his stolen confidence and my mother with her chin set high, the enormous hurt inside me transformed into a strange sense of relief. My 48 hours of maybe they didn't mean it were officially over. They meant it out loud, in broad daylight. I didn't argue. I didn't utter the words trust, forgery, or lawyer. I simply looked Julian in the eyes and used the flat, measured tone I normally reserve for overdue library fines. "Are you completely sure about that?" I asked softly. Before they could process my calmness, I closed the door in their faces. Through the frosted glass, I watched their shadows pause in momentary confusion before they walked victoriously back down my grandfather's steps. I stood in the entryway until their car engine faded into the distance. Then, my eyes drifted over to Grandpa Arthur's handmade pine key cabinet. 9 brass hooks hung under the hallway light, each with a neat, typewritten label. And that's when my blood went cold. The 4th hook was completely empty. I had rekeyed the entire house back in April, hanging the new spare key directly on that hook inside my locked home. Whoever took it hadn't broken in, they had been let in. My mind raced back through the months. Mother's Day in May, when my mother stood alone in this hallway while I plated dessert in the kitchen. Or June, when Julian wandered upstairs while I was downstairs boiling water. One of them had reached into my grandfather's system of trust while I served them tea and stolen a front door key to make duplicate copies. The forged quitclaim deed was a crime against paperwork, but that empty hook felt like a direct violation of my home. I pulled out my phone and dialed George Sterling at home on a Saturday. "How fast can we move?" I asked. "Monday morning at 8, George replied steadily. Then he added softly, "They'll come back before then, Clara. People like them always hurry when they think they've won. I'd like to be sitting on your porch when they do." On Sunday, I methodically cataloged the entire house. I moved the trust binder and my grandmother's heirlooms to a secure bank vault, then photographed every room, closet, and drawer so no one could ever claim I had looted the property. While inspecting the back door, I even found faint pry marks where someone had tried to break in weeks ago before securing a key the family way. My elderly neighbor, Vera, flagged me down from her rose garden. "I saw your brother standing out front on Tuesday taking photos of the house," she noted casually. Tuesday, the exact day Julian had recorded the fraudulent deed. He had stood on the sidewalk, photographing his stolen property like a car he was about to drive off the lot. And when I opened my mailbox later that evening, I found an unstamped, hand-delivered envelope waiting for me. Inside my mailbox sat an unstamped, hand-delivered envelope containing a notice to vacate, typed with my name misspelled and citing a statute from the wrong state. My brother had attempted to evict me using an unproofread template he found online. Sitting on the porch steps, I let out a short, bitter laugh. But then my eyes stung. This was the same boy who used to sit under my grandmother's table eating stolen cake frosting while I read to him. Somewhere between that childhood frosting and these adult felonies, Everyone in his life had called his behavior love and let it slide. I slid the fake notice into a protective sleeve, slept remarkably well, like a woman backed by two trustees, and waited for morning. At 8:40 a.m. Monday, a diesel box van backed onto Birchwood Lane, parking one wheel directly over my grandfather's curb. Julian stepped out first wearing actual work gloves, followed by my mother carrying folded banker's boxes, and a hired mover rolling a dolly. They made it halfway up the walkway and froze. Sitting on the porch swing in a felt hat, sipping coffee beside a folded newspaper, was 71-year-old George Sterling. And angled at the curb sat a sheriff's cruiser, with Deputy Kowalski leaning silently against the fender with his arms crossed. Nobody moved. The hired mover looked from the deputy to Julian, instantly recalculating his hourly rate. George stood up slowly, picked up his manila folder, and spoke in a calm voice that carried across the entire block without raising an inch. "Good morning. Which one of you is Julian?" My mother opened her mouth, but George raised a single, absolute finger. It was the gesture of a lawyer who had spent 45 years listening to mothers. She immediately shut her mouth. For the next 11 minutes, George systematically laid out the facts like cards on a table. Exhibit 1, Certified Title Report, George announced. As of April, this property is owned exclusively by the Croft Family Trust. It has not belonged to Clara Vance individually for 6 months, which creates a severe issue for Exhibit 2. He held up Julian's fraudulent quitclaim deed. This document purports to transfer a house from someone who does not own it, over a forged signature, witnessed by a fraudulent notary. It is void. It transfers nothing. And gentlemen, it constitutes 2 state felonies. The word felonies changed the physical air in the front yard. The hired movers immediately began backing up toward their van. The lead worker looked up at me in the doorway, nodded respectfully, and muttered, "Sorry, ma'am," before driving away. Julian went the color of unprimed drywall, staring everywhere except at me. My mother stepped forward to deploy her ultimate weapon, tears on command. "Officer, this is simply a private family misunderstanding," she pleaded. Deputy Kowalski didn't uncross his arms. "Ma'am," he stated coldly, "forgery isn't a family matter." As the deputy took official statements, Julian's composure completely shattered. Reverting to the boy he had always been, he pointed straight at our mother. "Mom said it was rightfully ours," he panicked, his voice cracking. "Mom said the deed was just formalizing things." My mother turned on him with a glare forged in a lifetime of storm weather, a look that commanded him to shut his mouth instantly. Before walking away, my mother turned to the street and uttered a sentence that would echo in my mind for days. "Everything I did to fix what my parents broke." She straightened her coat and marched to the truck like a woman leaving a restaurant that had disappointed her service. As she passed, I asked her the only question I posed all morning, using my quietest, most measured librarian voice. "Where's Grandpa's spare key, Mom?" Silence fell. Julian stared at his shoes. For one brief second, before her righteous mask reassembled, I saw the truth plain as a stamp on her face. Nobody said a word. She climbed into the truck with her folded boxes, and Julian followed her, the way he had followed her his entire life, into every net and off every cliff. Deputy Kowalski handed me his case number, noting an economic crimes investigator would be in touch. Soon, the street was empty again. By Tuesday night, the family phone tree had generated my mother's rewritten version of history. According to her, I was the villain who called the police on my own brother and humiliated the family. Voicemails poured in. An aunt spent 4 minutes scolding me for taking sides, while an uncle texted that Julian was just a good kid listening to the wrong people. Half true and completely useless. Only Aunt Ro called to ask if I'd eaten, staying on the line while I made toast. That was what real family sounded like. On Wednesday morning, Investigator de la Rocca from Economic Crimes called. His voice was tired but kind. He explained that while our evidence was rock solid, the fake deed, the expired notary, the stolen key, the state couldn't prosecute without one vital piece: my formal, signed criminal complaint against my brother. We get right up to this line, and family members refuse to cross it, he admitted gently. After hanging up, the quiet of the house pressed in on me. The legal trust had protected my property without requiring me to be brave, but the law could only take me so far. Filing criminal charges required my own hand, my own signature, against my own brother. I spent the evening organizing my cookbooks by title, a nervous habit. Eventually, I sat in the kitchen across from my late grandmother's empty chair. I found myself remembering something Grandma Dorothy had told me 2 winters ago about my mother. Your mother thinks love is a ledger. My grandfather Arthur had been a stern, rigid man about money with my mother when she was young, itemizing every expense and treating affection like an allowance. My mother had grown up inside that cold financial ledger, spending 50 years trying to collect a debt from the wrong people, because the parents who owed it to her were gone. On the porch, she wasn't lying. She truly believed she was fixing what her parents broke. But sitting in that quiet kitchen at 10:00 p.m., I realized something crucial. Pitying my mother and stopping her were not opposites. They were the exact same act. I picked up the phone and called George Sterling at home. When he answered, I spoke the sentence I had spent 36 years avoiding. Don't soften anything, George. File everything. There was no going back now. On Wednesday afternoon, my mother arrived alone. No press release, no baking, no Julian to hide behind. She sat in my grandmother's kitchen chair and cycled through her manipulations like a musician playing scales. First came the soft approach. Families handle these things privately, Clara. Julian is so fragile right now. When that failed to move me, she deployed her guilt. I raised you alone, everything I gave up. Is this the thanks I get? When I stayed entirely level, her voice dropped its theatrical tone and became dangerously cold. Sign that police paper, Clara, and you no longer have a mother. I got up, boiled the kettle, and served her a cup of chamomile tea, the same soft gesture I'd made 10,000 times over 30 years. It wasn't a trick. It was a quiet goodbye. She left without taking a single sip, her heels clicking down the steps like sharp gunfire. I didn't sign the paper immediately. Instead, I called Aunt Ro to ask about the real history between my mother and Grandpa Arthur. Ro quietly explained that at age 30, my mother had lost a failed business, and Grandpa Arthur hadn't just refused to bail her out. He had publicly declared she would never hold title to his property while he lived. Old age and grandchildren had eventually softened him for me, but my mother never got that gentler version. It explained everything about her bitterness, though it excused nothing. While we spoke, a text arrived from Julian's estranged wife asking if 6-year-old Lily could still come over for our monthly baking day. I replied instantly, always on. That settled it. This was no longer about punishing Julian. It was about which kitchen little Lily would grow up watching, another generation of quiet women enabling selfish men, or one adult in our family who finally let the truth cost what it costs. That night, I laid 3 items on the table: the investigator's formal witness complaint, my pen, and the empty brass key taken from Grandpa Arthur's cabinet. The blank line asking for relationship to suspect nearly broke me. Writing the word brother felt heavier than a lead weight. My peacekeeper's reflex almost made me dial my mother one last time, begging for a way out. But then I looked across the hall at the empty 4th hook in Grandpa's pine cabinet. Someone in my family had stood in my hallway while I served them tea, stolen that key, and returned with movers to take the rest. And they expected me to swallow it, just like every other sacrifice of my life. I set my phone face down where I couldn't reach it. The kettle coil clicked cool. I picked up the pen for the 3rd time and signed my real name. I signed my real signature, the level, unembellished handwriting built from thousands of library cards. Clara M. Vance, complainant. It was the quietest sound in the world for the loudest thing I had ever done. Before the ink dried, I pulled a second sheet and wrote a personal letter to the prosecutor. I agreed to cooperate fully, but asked that they consider Julian for a deferred judgment program, restitution, supervision, and a suspended felony hanging over his head on the strict condition of full repayment and no contact. I wrote the final line slowly. My grandparents built this family a house. I will not use it to bury my brother, but I am done pretending nothing happened. Signed, the person who kept the peace. As I addressed the envelope, my phone buzzed on my grandmother's chair. Mom glowed on the screen. I let it ring through 7 long buzzes, sealing the envelope with the flat end of my grandfather's brass hook. There were no grand cinematic outbursts. My biggest life decision happened at a quiet kitchen table in a bathrobe, beside cold tea, where the only composure I had to outlast was my own. The legal resolution unfolded steadily. The fraudulent deed was officially annulled, and Julian accepted deferred judgment, 2 years of supervision, total restitution, and a strict no-contact order for Birchwood Lane. The corrupt notary lost his license and faced his own charges. For the first time in 33 years, a real consequence arrived for my brother with his name spelled correctly. I saw my mother once during the proceedings, sitting outside the courtroom on a hallway bench. She looked smaller than the version of her I carried in my chest. I sat beside her in silence until she spoke, her voice bare and stripped of drama. "They never once trusted me, Clara, their own daughter. You got the childhood I asked them for." The entire engine was laid plain. Not raw greed, but decades of unresolved bitterness. I looked at my hands and offered the only honest response I had left. "I know, Mom, but I didn't take it from you, and neither did the house." That evening, I returned to Birchwood Lane and sat on the porch swing, letting it rock me the way it had rocked my grandparents through 40 summers. Inside, I retrieved Grandpa Arthur's small screwdriver and tightened the empty 9th hook back into the pine cabinet. Onto it, I hung a newly cut brass key. Using Grandma Dorothy's old typewriter, I typed a fresh tag, "Front spare, ask first." "Label it once," Grandpa used to say, "and it never argues with you." The cabinet was whole again, 9 hooks, 9 keys, every single one accounted for. The house wasn't empty, it was listening. And for the first time in my life, neither was I. By late October, life on Birchwood Lane returned to a quiet, steady rhythm. The family, naturally, drew its lines. Christmas would be smaller. Certain relatives took my mother's side, while Aunt Ro booked her flight to visit me, already asking for Grandma Dorothy's cinnamon roll recipe. My mother kept her word with absolute discipline. Total silence, a month and counting. It turns out total silence and an irrevocable trust have one thing in common: they cannot be changed. It still hurt, but it no longer ruled my life. Julian was working a warehouse job and making his court-ordered restitution payments right on schedule. A card arrived from him in the mail recently, no money requested, just a simple note. "Paying it back, all of it. Tell Lily I'm okay." I haven't answered it, but I haven't thrown it away either. Some doors you don't slam shut, you just stay honest about who holds the key. Meanwhile, 6-year-old Lily still comes over every Saturday. She stands on Grandma Dorothy's step stool in the kitchen, measuring flour like a jeweler. Unbeknownst to her, a $40,000 college fund grows quietly in her name through the trust. If I do my job right, she'll grow up never knowing the chaos her father caused. Only that somewhere back up the family line, a woman stopped paying rent on other people's peace. The house is warm, the locks are mine, and the 9th hook reads, "Ask first." And everybody does. I used to believe that keeping the peace was an act of love. It took a forged deed, an empty key hook, and a single signature at my kitchen table to realize the truth. Peace you have to keep buying isn't peace at all. It's just rent.